Nora Ellery had a rule. Lunch was the one part of her day that belonged to her. Not to the patients, not to the charts stacked on her desk, not to the well-meaning colleagues who still looked at her wheelchair like it was the most important thing in the room. 20 minutes, a corner table pressed against the stone wall, and a cup of coffee that was actually hot for once. She was 3 bites into her sandwich when the cafe door opened. The man who walked in didn't look dangerous. He looked like someone trying very hard to appear fine, shoulders back, jaw set, eyes moving across the room in a pattern that had nothing to do with looking for an empty seat. Beside him walked a Belgian Malinois with a scar bisecting its left cheek, a service vest, and the focused stillness of an animal that was always working. Every conversation in the room dropped by half a volume, then by half again. The man passed 4 empty tables without slowing down. He stopped at Nora's. He asked if he could sit with her. She said yes, mostly to get it over with. 90 seconds later, his dog lunged into the middle of the room and locked its leash around her wheel. If you've ever wondered what real strength looks like when everything falls apart, stay with us. Stories like this one are why this channel exists. Wheelchair instead of on her feet. Nora had eaten at her desk every day. It was easier. No one could position themselves across from her and tilt their head at that particular angle. The one that meant, "You're so brave," without saying a word. No one could pull out a chair for her with that half-second hesitation, that flicker of uncertainty about whether offering help was kind or condescending. But eating at her desk meant she never left her desk. And not leaving her desk meant the job became the only thing she was. And somewhere around the 3rd month, she realized she was disappearing into it. So she found the corner table at Blue Lantern Café. Stone wall behind her, sightlines to both exits. No one sitting close enough to perform concern. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. She was on her 2nd cup of coffee when he walked in. She noticed the dog first. That was unusual. Normally she noticed the person, the gait, the posture, the invisible weight people carried differently depending on how long they'd been carrying it. 3 years of working the neuro rehab ward had made her fluent in bodies that weren't cooperating with their owners. But the Belgian Malinois came through the door half a step ahead of the man, and something about the way it moved, not aggressive, not playful, but working, fully and completely working, pulled her attention before anything else could. Then she saw the handler. He was tall, wide across the shoulders, with the kind of build that came from years of functional use rather than deliberate cultivation. Mid to late 30s, maybe. A scar along his forearm, barely visible beneath the sleeve he'd pushed up to the elbow. His face was composed in a way that looked practiced, jaw set at a particular angle, expression neutral, in a way that neutral expressions rarely were. His eyes were the problem. They moved across the room in a pattern she recognized immediately, not searching for a friend, not scanning the menu board, not doing any of the things eyes do in a cafe. They were doing threat assessment. Fast, systematic, involuntary. The kind of scan you couldn't turn off once it had been trained into you. His hands hanging loose at his sides weren't entirely still. She looked back down at her sandwich. Not my shift, she thought. Not my problem. He passed the table by the window, past the two-top near the counter, past an empty 4-seat booth that would have given him plenty of room for himself and the dog. He stopped at her table. "Excuse me." His voice was even, quiet enough that she had to pay attention to hear it over the cafe noise. "Would you mind if I sat here?" Nora looked up. Then she looked pointedly at the empty booth 12 feet away, then back at him. "There are other tables." "Yes, ma'am." He didn't move. "I need one with a wall behind it." She almost said, that's not my problem either." The words were right there, familiar and efficient. The same verbal temperature she used with people who tried to make her disability into a conversation topic she hadn't invited. A wall, clean and clear. But her eyes dropped to his hands before she could say it. The left one had stilled. The right one hadn't. It was small, barely a tremor, more like a vibration, like something running just below the surface that hadn't broken through yet. She'd seen it before, not in combat veterans specifically, but in patients coming out of acute trauma responses, in people whose nervous systems were still sending signals the rest of them hadn't caught up to yet. She looked at the dog. The Malinois was watching his handler with the quiet, total focus of an animal whose entire purpose was narrowed to one person. "Great," she thought. "Fine," she said. "Sit down." He thanked her once briefly and didn't elaborate. She appreciated that more than she expected to. He settled into the chair across from her rather than beside her, angled slightly so his back was to the wall and he had a full view of the room. The Malinois, she saw the vest, now the ID tag Atlas in block letters, folded himself under the table without being told, with the practiced efficiency of an animal that had done this 1,000 times. For about 90 seconds, nothing happened. The café was doing its usual midday business. The donor group that had been touring the facility since 10 o'clock that morning was clustered near the far windows, half listening to a presentation from one of the center's development officers. A young resident was arguing quietly with someone on his phone by the counter. The espresso machine cycled. Silverware clinked. Nora ate her sandwich. The man across from her, she didn't know his name yet, sat with his hands wrapped around an empty coffee cup, shoulders carrying that specific tension of someone managing something internal that hadn't resolved itself yet. She recognized the posture. She'd worn it herself in a different context for longer than she liked to admit. She was reaching for her own coffee when the metal cart hit the counter. It wasn't even that loud. The service cart, one of the heavy stainless steel ones the kitchen staff used to move dishes, clipped the edge of the counter as someone turned too fast, and the impact sent a single sharp crack through the café like a starter pistol. Nora flinched. She wasn't ashamed of it. Loud, sudden noises made everyone flinch. That was basic human neurology. But the man across from her didn't flinch. He froze. There was a difference, and she knew it immediately. Flinching was a response. This was a departure, the specific, recognizable absence that happened when a nervous system stopped processing the present and started replaying something else entirely. His eyes went to the middle distance. His hands gripped the coffee cup hard enough that she could see the tendons in his forearms. His breath, which had been slow, controlled, deliberate in the way of someone managing something, stopped being any of those things. He was still sitting at the table. He was not in the café anymore. Under the table, Atlas moved. She heard it before she saw it. The shift of weight, the quiet scrabble of claws on tile. And then the dog was out from under the table, not jumping, not lunging, moving with that same focused economy he'd entered the room with. He positioned himself in the center of the main aisle, between the cluster of donors and the counter, and the leash still attached to the man's wrist pulled taut. The development officer stopped mid-sentence. The resident looked up from his phone. 3 members of the donor group took an automatic step back. The café went quiet again, a different quiet than before. Before had been curious. This was uncertain. Atlas wasn't growling. He wasn't showing teeth. He was simply there, solid and immovable, blocking the aisle with the calm authority of an animal that had decided this was where it needed to be. Then he did something that Nora didn't immediately understand. He turned, not toward the crowd, not toward his handler. He turned toward her, stepped to the side of her wheelchair and pressed the leash taut, weighted against her front wheel. Not tangled, not accidental. Deliberate. The way all of his movements were deliberate. He lowered himself partially, haunches down, and held position. Nora stared at him. The dog looked back at her with amber eyes that were entirely calm and entirely serious. And she had the sudden, disorienting sensation of being assessed. He's not reacting to me, she realized. He's using me. The wheelchair was heavy, low to the ground. It didn't move unless she moved it. Whatever Atlas had been trained to do in a moment like this, find something stable, find something that wouldn't shift or startle or disappear, he had found it. And it happened to be her. Which meant the leash connecting him to the man across the table was now running from a handler who was no longer fully present, through a dog pressed against her wheel in a line that was keeping something tethered. One person at the far end of the donor group raised a phone. Nora looked at the man's face, the distance in his eyes, the locked jaw, the breath that was coming in short, effortful increments, and made a decision that had nothing to do with her lunch break. She looked at the person with the phone. "Put that away," she said. Her voice came out exactly as she intended. Not loud, not aggressive, but with the particular quality of someone who was not making a request. The phone went down. She turned back to the man across the table, leaned slightly forward, and said quietly, directly in the same tone she used with patients who had stopped being able to locate themselves in space and time. "Can you hear my voice right now, or are you somewhere else?" He heard her. Not all of her, not the cafe behind her, voice, not the ambient noise of the donor group reshuffling itself at a cautious distance, not the low hum of the espresso machine that hadn't stopped running through any of it. But her voice specifically cut through in a way that other sounds weren't managing to, and he latched onto it with the desperation of someone grabbing at a fixed point in moving water. "Somewhere else," he said. The words came out rough, like they'd had to travel a long distance to get there. "Okay." She didn't react to that. Didn't soften, didn't tighten. Just took it as information. "What's your name?" A pause. "Grant." "Grant." She said it back to him the same way he'd said it. No inflection, no performance, just confirmation that she'd received it. "I'm Nora. I work the neuro rehab ward on the 3rd floor. I'm going to stay right here and talk to you, and I need you to try to follow my voice. Can you do that?" Another pause, shorter this time. "Yeah." "Good. Don't look at the room. Look at me." He did. It took visible effort. His eyes kept wanting to move, kept wanting to do the thing they'd been trained to do, which was account for every variable in the surrounding space. But he brought them back to her face and held them there with the focused strain of someone trying to read in bad light. Atlas hadn't moved. He was still pressed against her wheel, still holding the leash taut, still running whatever calculation he'd been running since the cart hit the counter. Nora could feel the faint vibration of the dog's weight against the frame of her chair. It was oddly grounding, a reminder that whatever was happening, something in this situation had already decided what to do about it. She had questions she wasn't going to ask yet. She had observations. She was filing away the specific quality of his dissociation, the way his hands were responding, the pattern of his breath, because that was what she did. That was the automatic background process that never fully turned off, regardless of whether she was officially on the clock. What she said instead was, "Atlas used my chair." Grant's eyes sharpened slightly. Not all the way back, but a degree closer. "I know, I'm sorry. He's supposed to wait for a command." "He did wait," Nora said. "He waited until he needed to." Grant looked down at the dog. Something moved across his face that she didn't have a name for yet. Not shame exactly. Not relief exactly. Something in between that hadn't settled into either one. He found the most stable thing in the room, Nora continued. That's what he was trained to do. Find an anchor point. Grant's voice was coming back steadier now. Physical pressure. Something that doesn't move. A short exhale. He's supposed to use me. You weren't available. The words landed between them without softness or cruelty. Just accuracy. Grant absorbed them the way someone absorbs a truth they already knew, but hadn't heard stated plainly. No, he said. I wasn't. The donor group had reorganized itself into a loose cluster near the far windows, maintaining the careful distance of people who weren't sure whether the situation was over. The development officer had stopped pretending to continue his presentation. The resident had put his phone entirely away and was watching with the expression of someone trying to learn something without appearing to. One member of the donor group, older man, navy blazer, the look of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any given room, was still watching, with the particular attentiveness of someone deciding whether to be concerned or offended. Nora noted all of this in her peripheral vision and set it aside. When did you get to Harbor Crest? She asked Grant. 3 days ago. First time out in a space like this. She gestured minimally, just enough to indicate the café, the glass walls, the population density. He nodded. Too much input. Yeah. He turned the coffee cup slowly in his hands. The tremor in his right hand had diminished, but not disappeared. It was running at a lower frequency now. A background condition, rather than an acute one. It's usually not this bad. The noise... He stopped, started again. There was a specific operation. The sound of that cart. You don't have to explain it, Nora said. He looked at her. I'm not asking for context, she clarified. I'm not your intake nurse right now. I just need to know where you are, and you already told me. A long moment passed. Then, unexpectedly, something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, nothing that relaxed, but a fractional release of something he'd been holding. Okay, he said. The door from the main corridor opened. Nora didn't need to look to know who it was. She'd worked at Harbor Crest long enough to recognize the particular cadence of Helen Voss's footsteps. Efficient, purposeful, carrying the specific rhythm of someone who had been pulled away from something else and was not pleased about it. Helen was 52, silver-haired, with the posture of someone who had spent decades making difficult decisions in underfunded environments and had the spine to show for it. She'd been a floor nurse for 15 years before moving into administration. Her clinical instincts were real. The problem was that somewhere along the way they had been overtaken by institutional ones. And Nora understood exactly why. Because she knew what had happened 2 years before she arrived at Harbor Crest. A veteran in acute crisis. A crowded reception hall. A situation that escalated faster than anyone anticipated. 3 staff members injured. A lawsuit that nearly ended the center. And Helen left holding every piece of the aftermath alone. She hadn't become rigid out of indifference. She had become rigid out of survival. The difference mattered even when the outcome looked the same. Helen took in the scene in approximately 3 seconds. Grant at the table, Atlas against Nora's wheel, the displaced donor group, the general disruption. Ms. Ellery, her voice was measured. I think we should let the staff handle this. The staff is handling it, Nora said without turning around. A brief silence that meant Helen was recalibrating. The dog needs to be removed from the common area. Helen moved closer, lowering her voice to the register she used when she wanted to convey authority without creating a scene. There's a protocol for service animals in. Atlas is doing his job, Nora said. If you remove him right now, you will make this significantly worse. Nora. The use of her first name deliberate, a small assertion of hierarchy. I understand you're trying to help, but we have guests here, and there are procedures. I know the procedures. Nora turned her chair slightly enough to bring Helen into her sightline without fully breaking contact with Grant. I also know that the procedure for a psychological crisis episode is not to escalate the sensory environment by introducing more personnel and more physical intervention. What Grant needs right now is less stimulus, not more. Helen's jaw tightened. She looked at Grant, a clinical assessment fast and practiced, then back at Nora. I'd like you to step back and let me take it from here, she said. The words were polite. They were also not a request, and there it was. The specific expression Nora had been navigating around since she came back to work in a wheelchair. The look that appeared on someone's face when they decided, regardless of evidence, that she was not the right person for this. Not because of her credentials, not because of her experience, because of the chair. Because the visual didn't match their internal image of competence, and they couldn't quite override it. And they didn't even know they were doing it. 3 years ago, she would have stepped back. Not because she agreed, but because the energy required to argue wasn't always worth the outcome. She'd learned to pick her moments carefully. But Grant was sitting 3 feet away, with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and his nervous system still in partial revolt. And Atlas was pressed against her wheel, and the donor group was watching, and Helen was waiting for her to fold. No, Nora said. It wasn't defiance for its own sake. It was a calculation, the same one she made 100 times a shift, about when to push and when to yield, about what the patient in front of her actually needed versus what the protocol said to do. He needs to get out of this room, Nora said, turning back to Grant. The noise, the people, the glass walls. We're going to move to the recovery hallway, and we're going to do it slowly. She met Grant's eyes. Can you stand? Yes. No hesitation. We're going to go through the door on the left. Atlas is going to walk with you. I'll be right beside you. If you need to stop, we stop. She paused. Understood? Grant nodded. Good. 3 anchor points while we walk. Pick a spot on the wall, a spot on the floor, and keep one hand on Atlas. Don't look at the room. Helen said behind her, Nora, I'm asking you to wait for... You can follow us, Nora said without slowing. Or you can manage your donors. I'd suggest the second one. She released her brake and moved toward the side exit, and Grant stood and followed, and Atlas fell into step between them, and the café watched them go in silence. They made it most of the way down the recovery hallway before it happened. The hallway was quieter than the café. Lower ceilings, indirect lighting, the particular institutional stillness of a space designed for slow progress. Nora had brought patients through here hundreds of times. It was a manageable space, a good space for recalibration. She heard the tray before she understood what it meant. One of the catering staff coming through a side door lost control of a glass-laden tray at the exact moment Grant passed the doorframe. The glasses didn't just fall. They hit the tile in an explosion of sound, compressed and sharp, bouncing off the low ceiling and the bare walls in a way that the open café never could have produced. Grant went down, not collapsed, not unconscious, but his knee buckled and he hit the wall, and then the floor, in a controlled descent that still looked from the outside like a man who had lost the connection between intention and movement. Atlas was on him immediately, not jumping but pressing full body weight against his handler's side, a physical counter-argument to wherever Grant's mind was trying to go. The catering staff member stood frozen in the doorway, surrounded by broken glass and apologies that couldn't seem to form into words. And then Helen's voice came from behind them. She had followed them into the hallway after all, close enough to see everything that had just happened. "That's it. I'm calling security." "Don't." Nora turned her chair hard, putting herself between Helen and Grant. "If you send security into this hallway right now, you will turn a medical episode into an incident. Is that what you want in the documentation?" Helen stopped. Something shifted in her face. Not capitulation. Not yet. But a crack in the certainty. She was looking at Grant on the floor, at Atlas pressed against him, at Nora positioned between all of it and her. And for just a moment, Nora saw it. The recognition. The memory of another hallway, another veteran, another moment when the response had escalated faster than the situation required, and everything had come apart. Helen raised one hand to the radio at her hip, held it there without transmitting. 60 seconds, she said quietly. Nora moved toward Grant. Atlas looked up as she approached and shifted fractionally to give her access without releasing his pressure against Grant's side. She stopped her chair directly in front of him, close enough that he would have to look up to see her face. "Grant." Her voice was the same as it had been in the café, same register, same steadiness. "You're in the recovery hallway at Harborcrest. You're on the floor. You're not hurt." His breathing was ragged. His eyes were doing the thing again, the distance, the departure. "I need you to put one hand on Atlas," she said. "Right now. Just one hand." A long moment. Then his right hand moved, found the dog's flank pressed in. "Good. Now put your other hand on my wheel." He looked up at her, a flicker of something, the specific uncertainty of a man who had spent his entire adult life being the one who held things together, being asked to hold on to something else. "It's not a metaphor," Nora said. "It's just the most reliable thing in reach. Use it." His left hand came up and found the wheel. Atlas exhaled, slow, deliberate, and the sound of it seemed to change the air in the hallway. "2 anchor points," Nora said. "Real ones. You feel them?" "Yeah." His voice was rough but present, closer than it had been. "Good. Stay there. Just breathe." The 60 seconds passed. Nobody moved to stop her. The hallway stayed quiet. Not the frozen quiet of the café, where silence had meant uncertainty and the held breath of people deciding whether to record or retreat. This was different. The particular stillness that settles over a space when everyone present has run out of things to say and is waiting to see what happens next. Helen stood 6 feet back, radio in hand, without demanding anything from it. Atlas had stopped pressing and started leaning. There was a difference. Pressing was intervention. Leaning was presence. The dog had made the transition with no instruction from either of them, as if he'd been tracking some internal measure that Nora couldn't see, and had determined that the acute phase was over. She was inclined to trust his read. "You with me?" she asked. "Getting there." Grant's eyes were on the floor in front of him. Not dissociated, just not ready to take in the full room yet. "Give me a minute." Take 2. She used them. Not to watch him. He didn't need to be watched right now. He needed to be allowed, but to think through what came next, and to sit quietly with something that had surfaced during the last several minutes and hadn't gone back down. She knew what the easy version of this looked like. Hand Grant off to the duty counselor. Documented as a patient welfare check. Note that the service animal had performed as trained. Recommend a trauma follow-up. Clean procedural, the kind of resolution that generated a report and filed itself neatly away. The problem with the easy version was what it taught people. She'd watched it happen enough times, people who had reached the edge of what they could manage, who had let someone see that, and then been processed through the system so efficiently that they came out the other side having learned one clear lesson. Reaching the edge meant becoming a problem. And becoming a problem meant being managed. And being managed was something to avoid at all costs from now on. She wasn't going to be the one who handed him that lesson. But there was something else sitting in the back of her chest, quieter and more unexpected. And it had to do with what she'd said to Grant when he hesitated to put his hand on her wheel. "It's just the most reliable thing in reach." She had said it practically efficiently, the way she said most things. But in the middle of saying it, she had also heard it, and it had landed in a place she hadn't prepared for. 3 years ago, in the rehabilitation unit, 2 floors above where she now worked, Nora had spent 4 days refusing to speak to anyone on her care team. She hadn't been able to walk, hadn't been able to stand without support, get from the bed to the window without 2 people and a walker. And she had found that fact so violating, so fundamentally contrary to what she understood herself to be, that she had shut down entirely. On the 5th day, her physical therapist had come in and sat beside the bed, without preamble, and said, "You keep looking at the chair like it took something from you, but right now it's the most reliable thing in the room. You could try using it instead of fighting it." Nora had responded with a precision that she was not proud of. She had also, 3 weeks later, started using the chair. She had never framed it that way out loud to anyone. But what she understood sitting in that hallway now was that the things she'd learned in that rehabilitation room, that stability wasn't weakness, that needing a fixed point wasn't the same as being broken, was exactly what she had just handed to Grant. Not as a lesson, as a reflex. Something that had become so integrated she hadn't even noticed she was doing it. She had been the fixed point today. And she had been able to be that because someone had once done the same for her. That recognition didn't feel triumphant. It felt quiet, and a little like something finally making sense. "Okay," Grant said. She came back to the hallway. He was looking up at her now, eyes clear, not fully. There was still something running underneath that would take more than a hallway and 90 seconds to resolve, but present. Located. "Okay," she said back. He exhaled. "I need to stand up." "Take your time." "I've been on this floor long enough." Something shifted in his voice, a dry edge, the first hint of something other than crisis that she'd heard from him. "Atlas is going to think I live here." Atlas looked at Grant with the patient expression of an animal that had seen this man in worse shape and was not unduly concerned. Grant almost smiled. It didn't fully arrive, but the structure was there. She moved her chair back to give him room. He got to his feet in stages, methodical, controlled, the way people who had been trained to physical discipline carried even their worst moments with a precision that looked like composure from the outside. He stood, rolled his shoulder once, looked at the broken glass on the floor, then looked away. "I'm sorry about all of this," he said. "You had a crisis response to an auditory trigger in an overstimulating environment," Nora said. "That's a clinical description, not an apology category." He looked at her. "You didn't do anything wrong," she said simpler. Neither did Atlas. Helen had moved closer during those last few minutes. Not intrusively, but incrementally. Nora acknowledged her with a look. Helen met it. She looked at Grant for a long moment, not the fast clinical sweep from earlier, but something slower, something that had more of her own history in it. Then she said, "Mr. Mercer, I'm glad you're still here." It was a careful sentence. It carried more than its surface meaning, and all 3 of them knew it. Grant received it with a single nod that held the same weight back. Then Helen looked at Nora. "I handled that poorly." "You handled it the way the current protocol allows," Nora said. "That's a different problem." Helen accepted the distinction with a slight tightening around her eyes that might have been relief. What do you need? A quiet intake room for veterans with canine support animals. On the admission checklist, not as an afterthought. Staff training on crisis response differentiation, specifically the difference between a dog that's out of control and a dog that's doing something the staff isn't trained to recognize. Nora kept her voice level. And a standing protocol that Atlas doesn't get separated from Grant unless there's a documented safety reason, not a perceived one. Helen was quiet for a moment. Then, I'll have a draft on your desk by Thursday. It was not an apology to her. It was not a public gesture. It was a woman with institutional power deciding to use it differently, which was worth more than either of the other options. Nora took it for exactly what it was. They stayed in the hallway until Grant's breathing had been steady for several minutes, and Atlas had shifted from leaning to simply sitting. The transition that meant, in his particular language, that the situation had resolved. Then Grant said, without particular ceremony, "Is there somewhere outside I'd like to be outside?" There was a rooftop terrace accessible from the elevator at the end of the hall. Nora had eaten lunch up there exactly twice, both times in winter when the café had been too crowded and the cold had ensured she'd have the space to herself. She knew the benches along the railing were low intentionally, though it was never announced. Someone had designed them that way and hadn't made a thing of it. She had always appreciated that. "This way," she said. The late afternoon light had shifted by the time they got up there, the sun dropping toward the horizon and pulling the harbor from blue into something closer to copper. A container ship was making its slow way toward the channel, running lights beginning to emerge in the early dusk. Grant sat on the bench nearest the railing. The bench brought him to the same height as Nora in her chair. She noticed him notice this, and noticed that she'd noticed, and then let it go, which was the right sequence of things. Atlas arranged himself between them without instruction. His head came to rest against Nora's wheel, his hindquarters pressed against Grant's foot. He appeared to assess this configuration, find it satisfactory, and close his eyes. For a while, neither of them said anything. The harbor moved, the light changed, the ship found the channel. "I keep thinking I should be further along than I am," Grant said finally. "Along toward what?" He thought about it. "Back to normal." "Who's normal?" He didn't answer. "The version of you that existed before that operation is not coming back," Nora said. "Not because something failed, because you went through something that changed the structure of things. You can spend your energy trying to reconstruct what was there before, or you can find out what this version is capable of. You can't do both at the same time." "That sounds like something from a pamphlet." "It does," she agreed. "That doesn't make it wrong." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "How long did it take you to stop trying to get back to before?" She considered the question honestly, the way it deserved. "I'm not sure I've fully stopped," she said. "But I stopped making it the main project. That helped." He nodded slowly. She looked out at the water. The container ship had cleared the harbor entrance and was moving with the clean momentum of something that had found the right current. Below them, the center was shifting into its evening rhythm, slower, quieter, the particular frequency of a building exhaling after a long day. "I used to run," she said, not looking at him. "Every morning, before any shift. It was the first thing I did. It was how I knew who I was." Grant didn't say anything. He understood the shape of where this was going. "I don't do that anymore." She kept her voice even. "It took me a long time to realize that what I was mourning wasn't running. It was the certainty, the thing I could return to every day that confirmed I was still myself." A pause. "I had to find out whether I was still myself without it." Are you? She considered it seriously. Mostly. Some days more than others. He nodded. Then quietly, I don't know how to be a SEAL who can't trust his own responses. Maybe you start with just being Grant, she said. See what that is before you reattach everything else. The harbor light faded from copper to gold. Atlas didn't move. He had decided where he was supposed to be and had gone to Ellery, she said. She shook his hand. Her grip was steady. So was his. And that was enough. There's something this story keeps coming back to. The idea that the people best equipped to hold someone steady are often the ones who've already learned what it feels like to fall. Nora didn't help Grant because she had everything figured out. She helped him because she'd been in a version of that same place, and she'd found her way through it. Not by recovering who she used to be, but by discovering who she still was. Grant didn't need someone to fix him. He needed someone to stand next to him without flinching. Atlas didn't malfunction when he chose her wheel as his anchor point. He found the most stable thing in the room. Sometimes, that's all any of us can do. Find what's solid, hold on, and stay. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. We'll save you a seat.